Sorry. Welcome to Good Thinking Live. We are here with good thinkers from all over the world. And the reason we're here is to give ourselves just a little bit of time away from all the time we spend being told what to think, so we can luxuriate and give our brains a little bit of time to marinate in improving how we think. So that's it. We're just here for this short time each week, and good thinkers from around the world know, who are regulars to the show. Let us know in the chat who you are and where you're from. And by the way, this is a conversation. So participate, ask questions, get involved in the conversation. And the thing that's cool about this that I love the most is that because we have this broad perspective streaming live from LinkedIn Live, every Monday, most Monday mornings, 9 a.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and YouTube Live, we end up with this broad, not only just a broad viewpoint, but also a broad perspective. And so it really is fun. So participate. I'm glad you're here. Welcome to the show, because today we're going to talk about questions that help us peek into the future. Ready? All right. So first question. It turns out we humans, we're kind of notoriously bad at predicting the future. So we're going to go through some particularly bad predictions, and then I'm going to welcome all the good thinkers to the show, because I see people coming on and I want to welcome everyone to the show. So who can guess who said that nuclear energy would never be a thing? Who can guess who said that nuclear energy would never be a thing? Bonus points. And as you know, rubber chickens for anyone who can guess that properly. And I'm going to say hi to some people. April, welcome from Texas. And Sierra from Washington. We're right down here in Portland, Oregon. Welcome from Port Angeles, launching point to some of the coolest islands. Barkley, welcome from DC. Michael, welcome from Toronto. Toronto gray matter in the house. All right, we've got, okay. Michael, of course, scores the first rubber chicken of the day. Einstein, I'm going to take this banner off. So even though we want good thinkers, all the good thinkers to share who they are and where they're from, we got to get room for the comments. Absolutely. All right, question number 2. Who can guess who predicted that a woman would never be a prime minister in her lifetime? I gave you a little hint, her lifetime. Anyone want to take a stab at that one? Well, while you're taking a stab at that, because we have a lag from LinkedIn, it's about 10 seconds behind YouTube, the good thinkers on each. I want to give everyone a chance to take a stab. Who can guess who predicted that a woman would never be a prime minister in her lifetime? The list goes on and on. So I'll give you a couple more so that we can see how we kind of know, gosh, I didn't predict that would happen. I didn't predict this would happen. But by the end of today, I think everyone will have a better idea of what kinds of questions you can ask to get a better glimpse of the future, and how you can kind of look at things in a different way to get a glimpse of the future. So the list goes on. So according to Western Union, there's an internal memo from 1876 that said telephones had inherently no value to us. The United Artists Executive rejected Reagan as the lead for The Best Man, Ronald Reagan. And the reason they rejected Ronald Reagan is they claimed he didn't have that presidential look. For those of you who don't remember, he ended up being the president of the United States from 1981 to 1989. Now, no one, that's just he didn't have the presidential look to play the part. In 1946, Daryl Zanuck, the 20th century Fox movie producer, didn't foresee a bright future for the world of television. Television won't last because people will soon get tired of staring at a plywood box every night. Now, he might have been right. Maybe if the box wasn't plywood anymore. So that's where you get to counterfactual thinking, which is a little hint at how we're going to tackle today. Well, what if it wasn't a plywood box? So it's fun to read about these public and massive prediction blunders and failures. And I always wonder, what questions did these predictors ask themselves that made them arrive at their spectacularly inaccurate predictions? So Michael says Indira Gandhi. Turns out that the person who predicted that, thank you for taking an attempt to stab at that, a person who predicted that there would never be a female prime minister in her lifetime was, drumroll please, Margaret Thatcher. Yeesh. Talk about not being prescient. Okay, so we all want to know the future. That desire to know is what makes us seek answers to unanswerable questions. So you want to start with we'll start with, we're going to do some marinating of curiosity, get our brains ready for this, because sometimes with thinking about these kinds of things and asking these kinds of questions, it's not only about how to think about things differently, it's also how do we unlearn some of these patterns so we can let more in? So we're going to start with some questions to prepare our brains for curiosity. You ready? Now, thinking about the future, how does this relate? Anyone come up with it? What is a pig? What is red? And what is a point in time? So you can choose to think about this. Take the easy one, maybe, unless you want to get really hard. What is the point in time, or what is red? What is a pig? Let's take that. What is a pig? Well, at first glance, these don't seem very difficult. These aren't difficult questions, but they're really actually hard questions, because practicing these kinds of questions can help you think about the future, because they open your mind up to complexity. And that's the key. Thinking about the future, you have to be open to complexity. And sometimes the stories we tell ourselves are not complex enough. They make sense, but we have to ask if what makes sense is what is really true. So who wants to take a stab? What is a pig? Well, most people will list physical characteristics like a pig. Like a pig has 4 legs and a snout, and it's fat. Okay, that's definitely true of some pigs, but we could reasonably consider a 3-legged pig still a pig, and a pig without a snout is not another animal. So what is a pig? All right, now we'll apply that. No one took a stab at what is a pig. Come on, someone in the chat. All right, we'll get harder then. So you left the easy one. What are the most popular questions you ask to prepare the future? Okay, think about these questions. When will this pandemic be over? Anyone want to take a stab? When will this pandemic be over? Will AI take over? Will my country be safe? These are questions that a lot of people, when you Google, okay, what's going to happen in the future? These are the questions that people say. So another one, what's going to change in the next 10 years? That's probably the most popular question across all industries, whether it's 10 years or 5 years or 30 years. It's what's going to change? And that will give you a little glimpse at how to ask a better question. Because I don't really love this question. I'll get to why later as we get into some science. All right. What will the future of work look like? That's a popular one on LinkedIn. I was actually on a fun panel not that long ago that discussed this, but I don't love this question either. I don't love this question any more than I love these other questions. They might be fun, but they're not that helpful if you really want to get a glimpse of the future. So Adam says a pig is an animal. Excellent. And what type of pig? And AI take over singularity. Ooh, I love topics like that. It's interesting because, as a little side note, I was listening to a panel of AI specialists, and they asked a very prominent AI specialist about singularity and artificial intelligence takeover, and she said that that's never going to happen. She says, for one reason, because artificial intelligence will never experience love. And I was like, what? Really? So I think that could be an Einstein level of predicting, or a Margaret Thatcher level of predicting. How can you see it otherwise? We'll get there in a minute. All right. Okay, this is a random question, but bear with me, because this is how we kind of marinate our brains for how to think, right? To improving how to think. Do you have a seasoning? That you use when you've made something or cooked something or bought something and it doesn't taste very good? It's not horrible, like you would throw it out, but it's just not that good. And you know that if you add sriracha, or you add tapatio, or you add Greek seasoning or za'atar, do you have a seasoning that you use? I call it like a go-to flavor transformer. Do you have a seasoning that you use? If so, put it in the chat. I'm gonna there's a method to this madness. I want to say something to Adam because we could do a whole topic on this. Adam and I probably are a little bit obsessed with this topic too. Singularity in the context of humans becoming inferior to AI. I think this is a really important question to be asking in the future. And Adam, I completely agree with you about disagreeing about that limitation. So yes, brain activity comes down to electron. Okay, you're speaking my language. I totally agree. I agree so much that I would have to ask myself, what are we learning that would make that not true? Okay, so I'm going to get to April, because April says pepper always makes things better. Okay, pepper, like regular black ground pepper. You have a specific pepper? I agree. I love pepper. Sazon. Ooh, okay. I got to look that up. Cajun. I mean, I could put Cajun stuff on like most things and make it better. Ketchup. Okay, a lot of people think ketchup. All right, there's a really good seasoning that I had in Costa Rica called Lozano. Is it Lozano? Lozano seasoning. And I had to order it off of Amazon, and it does make cracked pepper. Okay, cracked pepper. Totally. I would probably say two things. I put chili flakes on everything. I love za'atar. It depends, but I have family members who just put sriracha on everything to make it good. Flaky salt. Okay, Adam, don't cook unless it's a microwave. Okay, come on now. Let's kind of expand our horizons. All right. Well, the reason I talk about the flavor transformer is I like to think of when you guess the future, there's a couple of tools that you can use to transform an adequate question into a better question. And that I consider is kind of like the flavor transformer. What do you use? What method do you use? Kind of universal method or universal seasoning to turn an question into a really good question to see the future. Adam says, I'm serious. I really only cook in the microwave. We could have a conversation about microwaves. As an aside, we gave up our microwave years ago. And it does make things harder, but I don't look back, especially when you consider that you were saying that everything's electrical signals. So anyway, All right. So here is the flavor enhancer for your questions. It's counterfactual thinking. So any kind of question where you say, what does the future of work look like? And you say, well, the future of work is hybrid. One could argue that's the present, but I think a lot of times when we see the future, we see present and we maybe iterate around the edges. So we miss these kinds of leaps. But what would have to be true for that not to be the case? Those kinds of questions. And just an easy counterfactual question is, what would have to be true for that not to be the case? So what does the future of work look like? Blah, 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 blah. And what would have to be true for that not to be the case? Not something like a meteor would fall, of course, not those kinds of crazy things, but what really reasonable thing or things would have to be true for that not to be the case? That's kind of one of the flavor enhancers. And the other flavor enhancer, a little different than the counterfactual question, is getting more specific. Now, it is true that it is much more fun to make predictions that are kind of mushy, like the future of work is hybrid. How are you going to argue that in a year or 2 years or 3 years? How do you measure that? The thing about creating predictive questions is to be specific enough that you can actually measure your progress. And we're going to get into that when we get into a major study that shows the biggest differences between the people that see the future and the people who just claim to see the future. And one of them is really getting specific, because we're mostly wrong. We don't have to have a lot of things to go right for mushy predictions to look right, but it doesn't make us better in our predictions. It's kind of what to do versus how to do, right? And so Adam says we must always consider devil's advocate. And devil's advocate is good, but I like the idea of the specificity of counterfactual thinking a slightly better, because it really makes you identify, like, what would have to be, not what would have to, but really identify what would have to be different for a different outcome to be considered. So here's the next question. Are you ready? Guys, I'll have to participate. What did you predict the last time you were wrong about the future? What did you predict the last time you were wrong about the future? And it can't be like, well, I was wrong, but I mean, wrong about the future, just wrong. I can tell you many, many, many things. I don't tend to keep track of them. So that's why that is harder to answer than what did you predict the last time you were right about the future? Can anyone share? And I'll share mine, but you got to share yours. What did you predict? Well, I will tell you what I predicted. I mean, I can think of all kinds of things, but and I'm trying to get more specific in my predictions, like by this time, and mostly that's because in our workshops, in my company, Applied Curiosity Lab, in our workshops, we have two major workshops, one in applied curiosity and one in critical thinking, that we work with companies, and we use these tools to kind of see into the future. So our case studies are kind of futuristic. So I have to be very careful that I don't make too many bad predictions. Okay. So Chris says, trying to grate lemon rind or other citrus rind. Okay. COVID would last a month. Fair enough. I love it. You're being honest about, after significant regulatory fines, I expected Wells Fargo to be broken up. Yeah, that makes it logical. Taking the outside view might show a little bit of a glimpse into some of these things, like taking the outside view of COVID and taking the outside view of Wells Fargo. And I'll tell you something that I spectacularly missed. Armand, welcome. The pandemic will end in 2020. That was my prediction, which went totally wrong. Yes, I think you are in line with a lot of people who thought that it was going to be a short-term thing. And the other thing is, like, what does it mean for the pandemic to end as measured by? So it's very easy to say, well, I thought it would be only 5 years. And what is it? Because if you keep it amorphous, it's easier to be right. So I like that people are, you got to be a little bit self-critical without, it doesn't, not to break. We're not that fragile. We can poke at ourselves. And I'm going to poke at myself because I saw Twitter back in, when was it, 2009. And I thought, this is ridiculous. And here's the deal. And here's the challenge to this common why question. One of the reasons I think why is valuable is because it gets you, if you keep asking why, it gets you to the root. But you tend to do some narrative, falling traps to narrative fallacy, where you see what happened, what is the case now, and you make explanations for it in hindsight, like p-hacking, even some evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology, where you go, okay, well, that makes sense that we had that tail then because of this, this, and this. So that's kind of post-dicting. We're talking about predicting. So when I saw Twitter, I was like, why would people use that? That's stupid. I will never use that. That is, why would people use that? But the thing about that is I said it without really answering the question. And when I did answer the question, there was a little bit of moral judgment in that. Like, why people just want to be heard. They just want their name out there. Why, I would never, blah, blah, blah. Why would people use Twitter? There is no way that sharing, I just ate this meal or I just ate this piece of toast, has any interest for any people anywhere on the planet. Okay. But what I didn't do is, once I answered that question with my judgment and my moral indignation and my, I didn't do the counterfactual thinking, is what would have to be different for that answer to be different. And so that's why I think that if why, and Adam says it, I'm so glad you said this, the 5 whys, the 5 whys are great, but I think that they're very limiting because they can make us fall prey to the narrative fallacy. Well, I made a story that all makes sense, but we have to ask ourselves if what makes sense is what is true. And by doing this season enhancer, doing this question where we make why better questions, we can say, what would have to be different for my answer to be wrong? Or how would the world have to change for my answer to be wrong? So if I'm going to suggest the one thing that you think about in terms of counterfactual thinking, we hear about all this why, and that's my why, and oh, that's my why, and books are written and speeches are made, is to add to the why the what and how, so that you don't fall trap to thinking that what makes sense is what is true. And that's what I thought with Twitter. I completely said, why would people want to do that? Well, they want to get their name out there. Well, why would they want to do that? And at the end, I thought it was a dumb reason. And then I didn't say what would have to be different or how would the world have to look for my dismissal of Twitter to be wrong. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Adding how and what to your why can help you with that counterfactual thinking. And you also, if you make predictions, you kind of have to hope that everyone else is kind of crazy and didn't prepare for that same version of the future. Otherwise, you're just stating the obvious. If you say, oh, well, I thought this and this and this, you have to hope that you are actually seeing things that other people, that you're smarter than other people and seeing other things that people are not seeing. Otherwise, you're stating the obvious, and that might not be predicting the future. And that will leave you, it's good. Sometimes some of the things in the future are obvious, but we're not talking about that. All right. Like, I'm likely to have lunch today, but what would have to be different for that to be true? Why am I likely to have lunch? Because I'm hungry, because I always eat lunch. Why? What would have to be different for that to be true? How would something have to change for that not to be true? Right. So predicting the future can be fun. It's like a thought experiment, and it makes us feel like we're in more control, but we're basically guessing, and our brains feel like we're making sense. But by trying to predict things, we convince ourselves that we know things that are not necessarily knowable. And the future, your personal future, it's not like a single player or single variable game. It's like a multiplayer, multivariable game, and the odds are always changing. So let's borrow a little bit from Philip Tetlock's science, and then we're going to leave you with what I think is the most important, counterintuitive, not very often asked question to predict the future. And there's two people that agree with me about this question. So you don't have to just think, oh, who's Becky? What does she know about predicting the future? I don't claim to be a futurist, by the way, which is maybe a good thing when you hear about Philip Tetlock's research. But I'll share with you that the most important question to predict the future that I think is backed by both Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett. So maybe we're in good company. We're going to get to that by the end. But first, let's find out what Philip Tetlock said. So last week, heard Julia Pearl discuss the topic of his book, The Book of Why, The New Science of Cause and Effect. I love him. Isn't he, I think he had the journalist's son that was beheaded by ISIS. So anyway, yeah, I think he's brilliant. So I haven't read the book. So thank you, Mitchell, for that recommendation. The Book of Why. All right. And I think you can add to the Book of Why, the Book of What and the Book of How. So maybe there's the sequel. All right. So political scientist and Professor Philip Tetlock conducted a famous 20-year study. How many of you have heard of Philip Tetlock and his 20-year study? If you haven't, it's not surprising. If you have, it's not surprising. There's a lot to know about. But he took a group of experts to make a total of about 28,000 different predictions. And that's important because there's got to be a lot of predictions for this probabilistic information to work. So he took these were predictions about politics and war and economics, and it took about anywhere from 1 to 10 years. So this was a longitudinal study. And what did he find out about the experts? Anyone remember or know what he found out about the experts? It became kind of a funny meme at the time. But after scoring all of their predictions against what actually happened, and they had to be very specific. They couldn't say, oh, the pandemic will end soon. Well, what does soon mean? They had to be very specific about what it wasn't measuring this pandemic. It was before this, but the analogous kinds of predictions would be, what specifically will happen within this time frame. So it had to be measurable. And what he really found that after scoring all of their predictions, what actually happened was that experts were only about as effective at predicting the future as dart-throwing chimpanzees. So that became kind of this whole meme. Experts, futurists are only as good as dart-throwing chimpanzees. Okay, Adam, I got to give you a rubber chicken for this because The Simpsons, I totally agree. And I think this really speaks to how to become a futurist or how to ask questions to predict the future is The Simpsons for a whole lot of accurate predictions. I cannot agree with you more. I'm a big Simpsons fan, and I totally agree with you. Watch The Simpsons. But there was actually an inverse relationship between the fame of an expert and the accuracy of their prediction. So it wasn't that, if you're an expert, the more expert you are, experts were no better than, dart-throwing chimpanzees. I think Barkley has pointed out something this is counterfactual thinking right here. I'm going to give a rubber chicken for this one. Very impressive chimpanzees. You could ask, Were these chimpanzees trained to throw darts? I love it. That is the kind of turning your thinking upside down. I love that so much. Okay. There was actually an inverse relationship between the fame of an expert and the accuracy of their predictions. The more famous they were, the less accurate their predictions. And so this is, we want these clear answers. And so the media gravitate toward futurists with clear and provocative and easy to understand ideas. Their whys are clear. They give stories for the first why, the second why, the third why, the fourth why, and the fifth why. They are clear. And they say it with certainty and confidence. But here's where you have to be careful. Certainty and confidence does not equal competence and accuracy. Because while the experts on average did not make predictions that were much better than chance, there was a small subset of experts that were actually way better than chance and pretty good at making predictions. And Tetlock called these experts super forecasters. Many of you have heard of super forecasters. Maybe it's a new term. But here's what made these super forecasters so much better than the experts. Actually, does anyone want to take a stab at some of the things that made these super forecasters better than experts? All right. Well, you take a stab. I'm going to ask Michael's question. Does that mean that eventually the chimps will take over the world? We are chimps. We are chimps. Maybe mechanical chimps, artificial chimps. Were more famous people more accurate because they're fame, or were they more famous because they were more competent? Actually, more famous were less accurate. It was an inverse correlation between fame and accuracy. So that's an interesting finding, I think. It wasn't that on average experts were way worse. It was that famous experts had an inverse correlation between fame and accuracy. And that inverse correlation, could that be related to arrogance? It could be, again, you could say, why? I don't think we necessarily know. And that might not matter as much as what did the super forecasters do that others did not. Now, number one, super forecasters made a lot of forecasts. They made a lot of specific forecasts. So you're not just making one forecast. Oh, so-and-so's going to win the election. And then based on that one prediction, you're the super forecaster that gets hired to speak at this event. And no. Super forecasters made a lot of predictions with a lot of specificity. All right. So Barkley says something, outside thinking and base rates. I mean, I have to give you're absolutely right. Clearly, you know something about super forecasting. Adam says more famous equating to their own self-importance. Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe not. And was it because they put more thought before they spoke? Who put more thought before they spoke? Put more thought. Clarify on that one. Maybe. But again, I don't think I would worry so much about why the famous people were worse than average. I would think about, what do the best people do? What do the super forecasters do? Because Tetlock and his research partner, Barbara Meller, spent maybe years and years recruiting over 20,000 volunteer forecasters to participate in this massive forecasting activity that they dubbed the Good Judgment Project. And if you want to know more about it, just Google the Good Judgment Project, and you can participate. You can take a class in super forecasting, and you can participate in all of these forecasting competitions. It's very time consuming. I think Sierra hit something very interesting. Super forecasters look at data and patterns. Brilliant. Yes. Oh, the super forecasters, they put in more thought. Sorry. Yes. I think putting in more thought is probably true, but how? What kind of more thought did they do? What questions did they ask? I think super forecasters ask different questions than the rest of us ask. And that's what we're going to get. So how can we get these questions so that we can ask these questions? And what happened with the super forecast project that Tetlock and Mellers did was they figured out, they watched these forecasters as they made a multitude of predictions about things like the price of gold and protests in Russia. And then the Good Judgment Project actually competed as one of 5 teams in a forecasting tournament sponsored by the American intelligence agencies. And they funded this competition. The American intelligence agencies funded this competition in an effort to learn how to make better predictions. And FYI, these super forecasters did really well, in many cases better than some of these other teams. After the research, this is what they concluded. that, the super forecasters weren't necessarily math geniuses or, news junkies. They all had two things, and there's no question about this. And this doesn't relate to asking better questions, just maybe luck of the draw, whatever makes people intelligent and aware. They had this. I call it the AI of forecasting: awareness and intelligence. There's no question, and you got to be fair about this, that super forecasters tend to be more aware and more intelligent. But they also were told, it was also said that they put in more work. So what does it mean to put in more work? Well, it means that they are probabilistic thinkers. So if you say, I don't want to think about math, I want to use my intuition, go ahead and get this book. This is a good one, The Art of Statistics. Our intuition tends to not be a good replacement for probabilistic thinking. So if you want to be a super forecaster and you want to rely on your intuition, that's fine. The statistical likelihood is that you are not going to arrive at the level of a super forecaster, and you're probably not going to arrive at a better than average forecaster. That's just the sheer facts. Maybe you'll get lucky on one or two predictions, but across a bunch of predictions to really see the future, not so much. So you really have to understand basic probability. Basic critical thinking skill is probabilistic thinking. So instead of asking a question like, will inflation continue to rise, which you can always find a point in time to have the right answer, you have to get specific and say, will inflation reach X level by X date? So there's a level of specificity to allow for probabilistic thinking. And there's no beating around that. I want to say, no, you can just, with enough oomph and enough desire, you can use your intuition. Nope, not so much. So you have to force firm predictions, and you have to ask specific questions with specific timelines, and you have to do it across a lot of things. And then you have to constantly be updating your predictions. So if you are worried about being a flip-flopper, and that might be why some of the famous people were not the best forecasters, or the inverse relationship between accuracy, then if you have that fame on the line, you might have a disincentive to update your predictions. But updating your predictions is a requirement for being a super forecaster. Super forecasters tend to keep their beliefs from clouding their perceptions and perspectives. So they do this by taking the outside view. An outside view is a whole topic for a whole nother conversation. We'll do another good thinking on outside view, but they tend to take an outside view, which is kind of the opposite of your intuition. And they update as they go. And now we're going to get to, because we're wrapping it up, and I want to get to, the very most important question that you can ask yourself for those who stayed for the final show a little after 30 minutes. It's going a little long. I apologize. But who knows the best question for predicting the future? Everyone want to take a stab at it? It's a question I love. Like I said, that Jeff Bezos, Amazon founder and ex-CEO, and Warren Buffett used to predict the future. Are you ready? It's not what will change in the next 10 years and what's going to happen with this or that and why. No. It's what's staying the same. And if you want to ask with more specificity, what's not going to change in the next 10 years? What's not going to change? Because the idea of using this question isn't just to ask it. The brilliance of this question is when you commit to answering it. All right. So what's likely to change versus what's likely not to change? So if what's likely to change is A and what's likely not to change is B, what's a better question to ask to predict the future? You could disagree with me. I think this is a really good one. I like this. I like you're predicting that you're going to be back next week. And I'm glad you are. Very good thinker. But I want to give a shout out to Sierra too. What do people want? What do people want is a question that is probably not likely to change if you ask it at the core. And getting to the core, we should do another good thinking on MAP, what motivates people. That's my little device for what motivates people, intrinsically motivates people, is not likely to change. But then you have to go deeper and deeper. So Michael says B, what's likely not to change? All right. So if anyone wants to take a stab beyond Sierra at what is likely to not change in the next, let's say 5 years, 10 years, you could pick a date. What's likely to not change in the next 18 months. You can share it in the chat, whether it's live or after in the stream. Let's see what people think about what's likely not to change, because predicting what's going to change is hard, but predicting what's going to stay the same is easier. So why would you do something that's easier? Because it is technically more illuminating. Adam says, what can be improved and how? That's a good one. But I still think that a better question might be an easier question to answer, because you could really answer it. You can easily answer it. What's likely not to change? All right. And Sierra says people will be at home more often than usual. So when you say that, are you talking about 18 months? Are you talking about people being physically home? What about their virtual selves? So the more you drill down into the specificity, the more you can start to glimpse into the future by identifying what's likely to change, not what's likely not to change, and then getting really specific. What does home mean? What does people mean? Do we mean ourselves, our virtual representations? You can then start dissecting the meaning of all of these things. And that's where then you can ask, what would have to be true for that not to be the case? All right. So I'm going to say, April, what's likely not to change? Climate issues. Okay. Got to be more specific on climate issues. Over what period of time? What's likely not to change? Discussions of climate issues. Anyway, so see you next week. We went a little over. Sorry about that. See you next week on Good Thinking, 9 a.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, Monday on LinkedIn Live and in YouTube Live at Becky Saltzman. Just hit that bell notification if you want to participate and become a good thinker along with the rest of us. Thanks so much for being here.